North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to be speaking today on an act to amend the Department of Health drinking water guidelines. Before getting into the sobering debate that's underway, I wish to quickly highlight the village of Zabalos in my riding, as it was voted best tap water of BC this year according to the BC Water and Waste Management Association. In principle, the NDP support this bill's mandated guideline reviews, since it has long called for a national water policy to secure the principles of water as a human right and as a public trust. We need to have a discussion about more stringent national objectives and standards in line with the European Union, United States, Australia, and the World Health Organization. According to a 2014 report commissioned by the environmental litigation organization EcoJustice Canada, drinking water standards in Canada continue to lag behind international benchmarks. With a country as rich as ours and with so much freshwater resource at our disposal, it is quite shameful to be in this position, having to be debated drinking water guidelines in this House in 2017. 2/3 of all First Nations communities in Canada have been under at least one drinking water advisory at some time in the last decade, and people in many municipalities face repeated drinking water advisories. According to the latest figures from Health Canada, 85 First Nations communities across Canada are facing a total of 130 drinking water advisories, 98 long-term and 32 short-term. That does not include communities in BC, where a separate First Nations Health Authority tracks water quality. It was a major promise in the last election to end drinking water advisories in Indigenous communities within 5 years. But according to a recent report from the David Suzuki Foundation, the Liberal government is not on track to fulfill its promise and has no plan to get there. That's completely unacceptable, disappointing, and frustrating. There is no regulatory framework holding the federal government accountable for safe drinking water in Indigenous communities. This is largely because of provincial laws and regulations that apply for municipalities do not apply for reserves, which are considered federal lands under federal jurisdiction. Enabling legislation passed in 2013 gave the government the authority to develop water and wastewater regulations for First Nations communities under the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. But it does not compel the government to do so. This means that no level of government is currently held accountable to ensure that drinking water is clean and safe on reserves. Engineers working in the field apply provincial standards as guidance for their operations. However, because of this informal approach, it does not empower communities in their efforts to hold the federal government accountable when underfunding, equipment breakdown, and other issues prevent them from maintaining these standards. And without these standards, there are victims in the path of this neglect. Dorothy First Rider of the Blood Band says, "A lot of our community members are suffering from stomach infections that are due to unsafe drinking water. A lot of our infants are constantly being treated for a lot of infections that are due to unhealthy drinking water. That is just not okay in this country. We will never achieve true reconciliation without addressing this inequity, and indeed the injustice that has existed through this country for far too long with respect to drinking water. It is completely unacceptable that successive federal governments have failed to honor the fundamental human right to clean drinking water in so many Indigenous communities. There needs to be an expedient infrastructure development process. There needs to be more Indigenous decision-making in the process, and there needs to be greater transparency in how the federal government is working towards upholding its promise to end drinking water advisories within 5 years. The Liberals will claim that they are spending money, but the additional funds allocated for First Nations water systems in the 2016 budget represent less than half the amount engineering firm Negan Bernstein estimated was necessary in 2011. And Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada's funding pressures will likely worsen as it finances new plants, which tend to be more expensive to operate than their predecessors. In my riding of North Island Powell River, We've seen some progress in some areas. The Clean Water and Wastewater Fund joint initiative between BC provincial government and Government of Canada has awarded additional infrastructure dollars in the riding over the past few years. But there are still some important challenges ahead. We still have highly colored water or cedar water in some areas. Saline intrusion is an issue for wells on islands and near the coast where groundwater is often a reservoir of fresh water on top of the more dense saline water. Kingcome First Nation is concerned with their water supply, and Comox has had significant problems with turbidity, causing extended boil water advisories pretty regularly over the last few years. They have just settled on a proposal for a new filtration system and now are working on funding, in which we'll have a very large federal ask. It's so important that this be addressed, Mr. Speaker. Like Comox, too many municipalities continue to face repeat drinking water advisories. The federal government needs to step up to ensure that every Canadian community has access to clean drinking water. I see the bill before us today as a conversation starter because experts have clearly demonstrated that Canada is lagging on many fronts when it comes to drinking water. Here are a few examples that the Liberals need to take into consideration. Health-based long-term objectives. Canadian drinking water objectives and standards should incorporate health-based long-term objectives for drinking water quality similar to the maximum containment level goals established by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. These long-term objectives would provide a vision for the future and clarify the distinction between purely health-based objectives and standards based on other considerations. National standards for effective drinking water treatment. New Canadian drinking water objectives and standards should establish outcome-based treatment standards to ensure effective protection from microbiological organisms through advanced filtration, or an equally effective treatment process such as UV for all communities whose drinking water supply is provided by surface water sources or groundwater that is directly influenced by surface water. This step is needed to address the threat to public health posed by microbiological contaminants, particularly protozoa and viruses. The U.S. is already taking this important step. And finally, national standards for maximum allowable concentrations for microbiological, physical, chemical, and radiological contaminants. The U.S. and the EU both have legally binding standards for the maximum allowable concentrations in drinking water. Canadians should enjoy the same level of protection. One approach would be to create a federal safety net so that the national standards would only apply on federal lands and in provinces and territories that did not provide the same level of health protection as the national standards. In principle, the NDP supports this bill's mandated guideline reviews since it has long called for a national water policy to secure the principles of water as a human right and as a public trust. I hope the government will respond to our call for more stringent national objectives and standards in line with the European Union, United States, Australia, and the World Health Organization. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On a prise de débat, resuming debate, the honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's great to have an opportunity to speak this morning. I trust members had a good weekend, perhaps putting their final Halloween preparations together, getting their costumes ready. I hear the Minister of Defence has a good architect costume ready to go. The Minister of Finance is going to dress himself up as a champion of the middle class, and the Prime Minister is going to work as hard as possible to look like a feminist. So I'm sure we'll be seeing good costumes on display this week, and I wish members well in the celebrations. If the costumes don't go well, though, don't worry, nothing's going to scare children more than the deficit projections. Now, Mr. Speaker, with respect to Bill C-326, this is an act to amend the Department of Health Act establishing drinking water guidelines. For those who are just joining the debate, this bill amends the Department of Health Act to require the Minister of Health to conduct a review of drinking water standards in other OECD countries. It's a requirement to conduct that review, and if appropriate, so it's not required of the Minister, but if it is deemed appropriate after conducting that review, it empowers the Minister to make recommendations for amendments to the national guidelines respecting drinking water. Now, I know what members are thinking, but it's not as controversial as it might sound at first. This gives the minister the ability to, the added encouragement to conduct this review, to gather this information based on best practices in other countries within the OECD. And on that basis, we think it is a reasonable bill. It's something that we are pleased to support in the opposition. I think this bill will find support throughout the House as a way of moving forward and bringing more information into the assessment in terms of what we're doing with respect to drinking water. So with that explained in terms of the context of the bill, I want to make a few points with respect to it in general, in terms of water quality, in terms of the federal role, and in terms of the question of ministerial discretion, and then finally talking about how we incorporate the best science and information into the policy decisions that we make. So, first of all, of course, in the Conservative caucus, we strongly support high-quality drinking water. We think that the governments at all levels should do as much as they possibly can to ensure water is safe to drink. And we recognize that, especially in Indigenous communities, that there is a great deal of work that still needs to be done in that respect. But we think it is a basic principle that all people should be able to access this fundamental necessity of life, water. They should be able to access it in a clean and safe way. Of course, we live in a country that is geographically dispersed, that is very large, and that can potentially create some additional challenges. But it is still fundamental that people be able to access clean water. I don't think that's a point, Mr. Speaker, on which any members would disagree. But one of the things that this bill invites us to consider is the federal role in establishing standards. And certainly under the previous government, we believed in a federal role for establishing clean water standards. But at the same time, the practical implementation of those guidelines, for most Canadians, that implementation happens through other levels of government, at the provincial and municipal level, although, of course, the federal government has more direct involvement with respect to Indigenous communities. So there is